sworn in for a second term. Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed takes the reins again, but with no end in sight to the devastating war in Tigray and accusations of human rights abuses. Is he the right man to lead Ethiopia? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the inauguration of Abiy Ahmed. It was a difficult and controversial first term for Abiy Ahmed, but the Ethiopian Prime Minister has just been sworn in for 5 more years. When he first came to power in 2018, thousands chanted his name as Abiy mania swept over Ethiopia. After years of autocracy, the country was finally changing. And Abiy Ahmed was just what many people were looking for, a youthful prime minister from the Oromo ethnic group, which had long suffered political exclusion. Abiy released thousands of political prisoners and allowed banned opposition groups to return from exile. But arguably, his greatest achievement was a historic peace deal with Eritrea, bringing an end to 2 decades of war. It won him the Nobel Prize in 2019, and as he accepted the award, Abiy spoke of his hatred of conflict.
War is the epitome of fail for all involved. I know because I have been there and back. I have seen brothers slaughtering brothers on the battlefield. I have seen older men, women, and children trembling in terror under the deadly shower of bullets and artillery shells. You see, I was not only a combatant in war, I was also a witness to its cruelty and what it can do to people.
But less than a year after that speech, the Nobel laureate was waging his own war. In November 2020, the Prime Minister launched a military offensive in the northern Tigray region to overthrow the regional ruling party. The government claimed an attack by Tigrayan rebels on an army base forced them into action. But tensions had been simmering for months, and the decision by the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front to hold elections against Abiy's wishes pushed things over the edge. Now, almost a year later, the fighting rages on, and so too does the impact left in its wake. More than 5 million people in northern Ethiopia now need urgent assistance, most in the Tigray region. As of April 2021, at least 1.7 million people have been internally displaced, and more than 350,000 are on the brink of famine. Well, despite all this, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed managed to easily secure a second term. His Prosperity Party took 410 out of 436 seats in parliament. But whether the election back in June was free and fair remains up for debate. Several opposition parties say they were the victims of intimidation and harassment, and the U.S. called the vote significantly flawed. Abiy's standing on the international stage has fallen dramatically since coming to power. Once widely praised for ushering in reforms, he's now accused of overseeing human rights abuses, and his government is facing the prospect of U.S. sanctions. His reputation also took another hit with his decision last week to expel 7 UN officials from the country. The Ethiopian government accused them of meddling in internal affairs. The UN says they were delivering life-saving aid. Well, it's been a striking fall from grace for Abiy Ahmed, and despite being inaugurated this week, the Prime Minister has become increasingly isolated. But can he repair his reputation over the next 5 years? And will he be able to overcome the many challenges he's set to face in his second term? To discuss that now, I am joined from Addis Ababa by Hailu Kebede, the head of foreign affairs for the opposition Salsay Weyane Tigray party. Awol Allo is a senior lecturer in law at Keele University and nominated Abiy Ahmed for his Nobel Peace Prize in 2019. And from Washington, D.C., Cameron Hudson, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Africa Center and former chief of staff to the U.S. envoy to Sudan. Thanks all so much for being with us. Let's begin, if we can, with the swearing-in ceremony on Sunday. Controversy and complaints of electoral exclusion aside, Abiy Ahmed is again prime minister, yet from what we've seen, actually, very few international dignitaries attended. Only 3 African leaders actually were there from Somalia, Nigeria, and Senegal. There are some of the reports of some others from either Kenya or Djibouti. Awol Allo, let me start with you. Was COVID the excuse, or does it actually say something about other leaders wanting to steer clear of Abiy now?
Well, I think perhaps the number of leaders from across the continent that attended compared to in the past, I think significantly high, because it's actually very unusual in Ethiopia for the government to invite a huge number of dignitaries to come and attend the inauguration ceremony. I think this says quite a lot about the extent to which the prime minister is really obsessed with ceremonies, pageantry, and pomp in terms of kind of enhancing his legitimacy in front of the Ethiopian public. But I think most importantly, when this election was scheduled, when it was planned, it was hoped to be an election that would help Ethiopia turn a page and open up a new chapter towards a more democratic, inclusive journey. But unfortunately, over the course of the last 3 years, what we have seen in Ethiopia is a significant consolidation of a very personalized authoritarian power, shift towards more dictatorial tendencies, a very dictatorial way of solving major national questions, to the point that now the country has delved into a civil war characterized by significant humanitarian crisis and, of course, international isolation. And I think the fact that there aren't any leaders from outside the African continent in some ways, I think, signals or indicates the extent to which the international community is frustrated with the prime minister and with the humanitarian crisis in the country.
He wanted that validation, obviously didn't get it. And Awol, it's especially all of this is disappointing for you because, as we mentioned, you voted for him for the Nobel Peace Prize. I think you've just described, in effect, why you wouldn't do that again.
Of course, I mean, when I nominated the prime minister, this is in January of 2019. He was only in office for the previous 9 months. And those were moments when he has taken some very promising, very progressive steps by way of releasing political prisoners and also, making promises. And I thought this is the individual that kind of had the personality, the character, the belief, the determination to steer Ethiopia through what was a very turbulent period. I was obviously wrong in my assessment of that situation. I expected the prime minister, at the minimum, to rule out using war and violence as a means of resolving political disputes. My view at the time was that a Nobel Peace Prize would serve as a recognition of his efforts, but also would serve as a call to action. It wasn't so much that he has achieved enough, therefore recognition is deserved or necessary, but it would serve as a call for action to spur him to do even more. That was my assessment at the time, but obviously things have gone in a completely
Turned
different
out quite
direction.
differently. Right. Cameron, let me ask you, I mean, who does have confidence in Abiy Ahmed now? Where is his true support coming from, especially if members now of his own ethnic group, the Oromo, are now, some are actually siding with the Tigrayan TPLF?
Well, I think it's clear that his base of support has been eroding for some time, despite what looks to be an overwhelming electoral victory. The base of support on the ground has eroded. We've seen ethnic violence breaking out in as many as 8 states across the country right now. So clearly, the reform process that he ushered in 2 years ago is now unleashing forces, I think, well beyond his control or even understanding in some respects. And so I think he's falling back to a kind of hardcore group of Amhara supporters who are, I think, driving in many ways some of the more extreme policies that we've seen in the last few months. But I think internationally, you've seen, all support for him dry up, as your guest just said. I mean, falling from grace from a Nobel Peace Prize to now not having anybody coming into his inauguration. But I think more importantly, actively kind of making war with the international community, expelling last week 7 heads of UN missions from the country, obviously flouting the threat of sanctions that has been levied on him by the United States. So clearly, this is a leader who is entrenching himself into office right now, and I think paying very little concern to the consequences of his actions externally.
Cameron, then do you think, I mean, what do you think of the cynics, I should say, that, insist in hindsight that the reconciliation with Eritrea, for which Abiy Ahmed received the Nobel Prize, was more a cynical ploy to, be able to manage rebels near the country's two borders, in the country's borders in Tigray?
Well, certainly given events of the last year since November, it's hard to see that rapprochement between Ethiopia and Eritrea as anything other than a military tactic, and that there was a long-term plan in place, presumably that President Isaias of Eritrea, had in place and sold to Prime Minister Abiy, which was to consolidate control over this region and present a view of what they could do together in the Horn of Africa to unite under a banner that Isaias has been waving for very long, which is a kind of anti-Western Horn nationalistic approach to politics in the region. We've seen some success of exporting that to Somalia more recently, but I think when you step back and when you look from afar, it looks like just a greater degree of instability, which is again what Isaias I think has been trying to achieve for many years now.
Okay, Hailu, let me get to you, because I'd like to get a better understanding of what's actually happening then on the ground. You've been saying that people are starving, actually, and not because they're poor, but because there is no food. What exactly have you been hearing from your contacts in Tigray, especially now that they're kicking out UN workers that could have communicated more of the on-the-ground reality?
Well, it's hard to get information because there is no any means of communication. But some people manage to travel to the borders of Amhara, and some of them called us, and some work in these NGOs, try to connect us through the VSATs. So what we are hearing from the ground is very horrific. It's a disaster. This man-made starvation, a deliberate starvation to annihilate an entire ethnic or an entire nation is very disappointing, especially at this age in the 21st century. So what we are hearing is people are dying, children are highly malnourished. There is no medication, so any sick one cannot be treated. So it's a disaster,
And Hailu, you've also said that the world can easily save them. I mean, exactly how? What do you propose that the international community or anyone outside of Ethiopia can really do for the people you fear are starving to death?
Look, this is an international crisis. It's not a domestic crisis. And a lot of countries have involved in this war. So it should be solved internationally. There could be air bridge flights. There could be a lot of means to, to protect numerically a minority nation, which is being exterminated by cruel enemies from the north, from the south, and a very disappointing leadership at the federal level. So it can be saved if the world comes together, if the main powers come together, the Security Council come together. It could be solved easily.
Let me ask.
Yeah.
I want to put that to Cameron then. Is it that easy? Do you think the international community could be doing a lot more? Because there's many say a risk of this war falling off the radar outside of Ethiopia because of the clampdown that was mentioned on information and communication in Tigray. And this crisis is competing with so many others now for international attention.
Well, that's all true. I mean, I think you've seen from the very beginning the prime minister trying to limit access to the region, trying to limit information coming out of the region, whether it was through shutting down the internet or denying journalists access, now humanitarian workers access. So really trying to limit the stories that can emerge so that we don't have a full picture of the nature and the extent of the deprivation going on inside Tigray. I think we've eroded that over time. We've gotten enough images. People have been able to access the region increasingly, so we have a much better understanding of of what's going on. I think the question is, as you rightly point out, what will be the effect of international efforts to try to bring the prime minister to heel? And there, I think we've seen a very mixed record in other atrocity situations around the world. I think you look at Myanmar and the plight of the Rohingya there. We've only had limited effect, even though there has been a great deal of international attention and focus on that. And I think one reason why we've seen limited effect to change the calculus of Prime Minister Abiy is because he is getting protection at the UN Security Council from China and Russia, who continue to use his own language that this is an internal conflict. I would agree with your other guest that this is not an internal conflict. This is an international conflict of the highest order and magnitude. And when we look at what the mandate of the UN Security Council is, it's to respond to threats to peace and stability internationally. And this is, by definition, that. So the UN really should be taking on a much more active role in trying to put pressure on the government right now to allow workers back in, to allow access, and they're just not having any success at all. Really, it's only the United States thus far that has even threatened the use of sanctions. Let's remember those sanctions have actually not even gone into effect yet. It's just the threatened use of sanctions, because I think there are so many out there that want to try to roll back the clock on this government, on this prime minister, and go back to that period of 2018, 2019, when he was a new generation leader that was going to usher in a period of peace and security for the Horn of Africa. That's just not the case, though.
Right. And while seeing where he is now, and as Cameron described, the UN Security Council is divided over Ethiopia. It's not going to take the kind of action that is needed. So if it is technically in the government's hands in Addis Ababa to change the situation, ideally, how does the government want to see these conflicts resolved?
Well, unfortunately, the problem is that the government doesn't seem to think that it is its responsibility as a government in control of the country to find ways of resolving the problem. And I think whenever the international community, particularly specific governments such as the United States, tried to engage with the government, the response of the government was extremely unhinged. And when you look at the actions of the Ethiopian state over the course of the last 8-9 months, it's very difficult to see how this conflict could really be resolved through a peaceful means. But the question you asked me is, if it is up to the Ethiopian government, what is it that the government needs to do? And I think the first and most important and the most urgent step that the Ethiopian government needs to take is open up these corridors and provide humanitarian access to the population that are desperately in need of food. Saving lives is a priority. The government must do that. I think the government should not see this as something over which they have an authority. It's an obligation that is moral and legal. And I think the second most important step is to find a way to solve the underlying political problem with the various groups in the country. And I think this goes back to the point that we're making earlier, which is about the way in which the prime minister, instead of trying to build consensus around the future of the country, he tried to shove his particular vision down the throat of everybody. And I think ultimately we have to go back to that point. But to go to that point, it's important that the warring factions come together and find a way. And
actually, though, I was trying to understand, if the government does have all the power in its hands, the international community is not going to intervene the way many would see fit. So what would allow the government to feel that it has the situation it wants to achieve? What would have to happen on the ground in Ethiopia for the government to say, okay, we are stopping the military intervention and somehow we're reuniting Ethiopia? What would be the ideal conditions for the government?
So what you have is this radical contrast between what the government wants and what the various forces within the country want. So insofar as a common ground is concerned right now, I don't see a common ground between what the federal government of Abiy Ahmed wants and what the regional government.
I understand, but what does the government want?
Well, the government wants for the rebels in Tigray, for example, to give up and surrender. It wants the various forces that are fighting against it in the Oromia regional state, in the Benishangul regional state, to surrender. And then it would impose its particular idea of unifying the Ethiopian state. And this is an idea that has been rejected historically, not just the last 3 years since this prime minister, but also over the course of the last 50 years. It's precisely these irreconcilable, antithetical visions about Ethiopia's future that led the country to the point where we are now, a humanitarian catastrophe.
Okay. And let me go to Hailu, because I want to talk more really about what's at the core of this. There are so many grievances around marginalization in Ethiopia. Even, as we said, even members of the president's own ethnic group are now fighting with the TPLA. Help us understand what is at the root of that feeling of exclusion, and why can't it be addressed effectively? Because what we're hearing so often described now is the balkanization of Ethiopia, as if that is the only solution, because this unity cannot be found, especially with Abiy Ahmed in power now.
Well, as Awol was saying, the historical and political, nation-building narratives in Ethiopia were very divided. They were very radical, and to some extent, it has been a very how can I put it? A very violent interaction. So Ethiopia is now at the verge of balkanization, as you said it, because we have a lot of differences, and the government in power is not ready to reconcile this. While Prime Minister Abiy started his tenure as a reconciling figure, but he is tearing up the country. While he started with coming together, but he's tearing up the country. He invited a despotic regime from Eritrea to avenge the people of Tigray for what has happened in the last 20 years. So I cannot see any reconciling or healing mechanism for Ethiopia. The best way is, I think, from now on, the people should be given to decide on their fate, especially the Tigrayan people, after what they have been going through. There should be a referendum on our future. The people should decide on what's best for them.
Cameron, can we officially say that Ethiopia is descending into civil war via ethnic conflict, and that the only true solution, as we've really heard over the course of this panel discussion, is that breaking up the country seems to be the only way, giving people their autonomy and their own choices in their governance as individual regions?
Well, again, that's not something for the international community to decide for Ethiopia. It's going to have to come through a domestic process. There's going to have to be, first and foremost, peace on the ground in order for there to be a dialogue, whether that's a political dialogue or some kind of constitutional dialogue. The prime minister has said that he intends to hold a national dialogue to heal the nation, but he's also said that terrorist groups like the Oromo Liberation Front, like the TPLF, are going to be excluded from that, just as they were excluded from elections where he won 95% of the seats. So it's hard to square what he is saying with the prescription for solving Ethiopia's problems. So I think it's going to take a long time. But first and foremost, there's going to have to be some kind of peace or truce on the ground to create the space for some kind of dialogue to happen.
Do you have any hope that he will actually prove to be the peacemaker he was initially awarded for being?
My fear is that any victory in Ethiopia is going to be Pyrrhic, that there is going to be massive devastation that will force one side to relent. But it's going to take, I think, total victory by one side. And that total victory is going to come at a massive human cost. And that's what I'm afraid of.
Okay, Cameron, unfortunately, we're completely out of time. I'll have to give you the last word. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us. And of course, to our viewers as well, remember you can follow us on Twitter at @the_newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.